Next tool we're going to look at today is our double bevel sliding compound miter saw. Most of you would have seen miter saws or chop saws, different names that your parents or you use for the saw, or maybe even your shop teacher coming up through. But we're using the proper name because every section of that proper name has a feature that's relevant to this tool. So we're going to walk through the name first, explain all the features, then we'll talk about our table, our fence, our supporting stand with the support arms, and then we'll get into actually cutting a piece of stock. So let's get ready. Double bevel. Bevel, once I lay a piece of stock on my table, a bevel is a cut on an angle from the surface of the material, from the top. So we're cutting down on an angle from the top, whether it be from the right or the left. Because this is a double bevel, we have the ability to do both. Your lock for your double bevel is right back here. Big red lock. So we're simply going to pull that forward. Once we pull that forward, we can bevel the saw to the left. We've got our measurements right here in angles, in degrees. So if I want to set it at 40 degrees, once I get there, I can simply lock it in place. And I can do a 40-degree bevel. Okay? Just to demonstrate the double bevel, I can also take my saw and I can bevel it the other way. Corresponding gauge over here for my angles, find the angle I want and lock it in. Now one thing you'll notice, if I semi-lock it right now and start to slide, it actually locks in at various angles. Okay? Those are called positive stops. Okay? They're common angles used in carpentry, and these angles are used repeatedly by carpenters. So those angles are positive stops. The saw will lock into those positive stops. To get out of one of those, I simply pull it up, put it partway back, and I can go back, and my next positive stop here happens to be 0, which is where the saw is used primarily. Once we're there, even though it's a positive stop, we still want to double lock the saw. So we're going to push that lock down right there. So that's our double bevel. Next part of the name is sliding. Okay, this is a 12-inch saw. The blade on this saw is 12 inches. And if you look closely on this side, portions of that 12-inch blade are behind the fence. So I'm not going to be able to cut a full 12-inch cut. Okay, it's generally about 7 1/4 to 7 1/2 inches on a 12-inch blade. In order to expand that cut, this saw has the ability to slide. So the locking mechanism for our slide is right here. We're on 2 rails. It's a 2-rail system for sliding. If I simply unlock, what I can do is I can pull the saw forward. And that obviously expands my depth of cut drastically. Okay, to about 14 inches on this particular saw. Okay, when it's not needed, the saw is much safer as a fixed saw. Fixed saw means the saw can just simply go up or down. Okay, so we've talked about our double bevel. We've talked about our slider. The last part is compound miter saw. Compound I'll get to right at the end. Miter cuts. This saw has the ability to do a miter to the right, a miter to the left. So instead of cutting from the top, now we're cutting from the front. So our unlock button is right here. We simply turn this clockwise to lock, counterclockwise to unlock. There is a trigger right here. If I squeeze the trigger, I can move to the right. I can move to the left. I've got 60 degrees of range on the right-hand side. I've got 55 degrees on the left. A typical miter saw, a cheaper one, will give you 45 and 45. Okay, so again, you get what you pay for with these saws. Again, still have positive stops here as well. So I've released the trigger. I'm just going to move it slowly, and it locks in at 15 degrees, common angle. If I squeeze the trigger and start it again, I can slide it again, locks in at 22.5. Another commonly used angle in carpentry, positive stops. Even though they lock in, we still want to double lock our saw right here with the lock button. That's just a double safety. It should never come out of those positive stops, but we're not going to take the chance that it might, so we're going to double lock. to go back to our 0, we're simply going to release our lock button, bring it back to 0, it locks in at 0, and we'll double lock. So, double bevel, sliding, compound miter saw. So the compound part. Compound means we can release this, set it at a bevel, release here, set a miter, and now that's our compound angle. We're cutting a bevel and a miter all in one process. So that's our compound angle. Okay, great feature to have, especially if you're doing crown moldings. Crown moldings lots of times require a compound angle cut. So that's our compound part. So before we move on, we're going to lock it back at 0. There we go, that's 0. We can release here, just start our slide, locks in at 0, so let's double lock. So we've talked about all the features of the saw. Now let's talk about the bed of the saw and the stand that we have here to support the saw. The saw, when it's not in use, should be locked down. I can move the saw a little bit, but it's going to always spring back. We've got a fairly heavy spring in here, and when I unlock the saw, and that's just the unlock button right here, the saw is going to retract. Okay? The saw, if the spring is in good operating order, will always retract to the full up position. And that's where the saw should be in all operations to start, is in the full up. What you will notice is that as the saw retracts to the full up, our guard, which is right here, retracts, and as I come down, the guard opens slowly, just enough for the blade to contact the wood. Okay, as I retract, the guard closes up again to cover the blade so that we don't have a exposed spinning blade. Okay, why is the saw in a full up position? That's so that the operator has to intentionally bring the blade down to engage in the stock. There's no risk of this saw dropping onto a piece of stock accidentally. It has to be physically pulled down by the operator. So we're going to leave it in the full up position right now, and we're going to talk about the table of the saw. So right here we've got our table. We've got a fence system back here. This is common to all of our tools. We've got a red throat plate. And again, red to signify that if your fingers are in that area, you're in a very dangerous area. You will see two symbols right here, circle with the line drawn through with a set of fingers. Technically, by our rules, our hands never get within 6 inches of the blade. And the 6 inches on this blade is represented by the circular part of this table. Okay, no matter how we rotate that, the 6 inches stays consistent because it's circular. So we're going to make sure our fingers stay outside that 6 inch area. So we'll position our stock. Your stock always needs to be flat to the table and push back against the fence. The reason being, this blade spins in a downward direction and back. So when I bring the saw down to make contact with the stock, the torque is going to be down and back. So if my stock is not actually back against the fence, when the blade touches, it's going to throw it back. Okay? So we need to be back against the fence and flat. How do we ensure that our stock is flat? Our table, our stand has extension arms. So no matter what stock you're cutting, you always extend your extension arms out so that your stock is self-supporting. Your focus should not be on trying to balance a piece of stock. Your focus should be on the saw, the blade. It should be easy to hold your stock in place. I have the fence auxiliaries removed there because one of the features I like is that I want to be able to lock my fingers into that fence. If my hand is just resting on the piece of stock and the stock moves, my hand is going to move with the stock. Whereas if I lock my fingers into the slot for the fence and then push down, now my hand can't move. My hand is locked in place. So the wood may move, but my hand is going to stay away from that blade. Okay, so again, when we get ready to cut, we're simply going to have our stance right here. We're to the left. It's a right-handed tool. Why can't I use it this way? The reason I can't use it this way is when I start to pull down the saw, my forearm of my left arm obstructs my view of the blade. So I'm always on the left side of the saw, using it with my right hand, and as I pull down, I have an unobstructed view of that blade at all times. And I have to be able to see that blade at all times. Okay, so now that we've discussed all the safety features, let's actually go through and demonstrate making a cut. So again, you approach the saw is in the lockdown position. Push down with the palm of your hand to take the pressure off the spring, release the button, and let the saw retract. Make sure you hold the saw as it's retracting. It will spring up fairly quickly. We're going to position our wood. We're only going to make a small cut. And again, this is a cross cut. So if you're looking at the grain of your wood, we're cutting across the grain. This saw is not meant for cutting with the grain. That would have been the table saw that we discussed previous. So we're doing a cross cut. We're going to position our body to the left. Good grip. It's a 2-finger trigger. It's a fairly big trigger, so you're going to need 2 fingers on that trigger. Get a good grip on the stock. Again, my fingers are 6 inches away from that blade at all times. I'm going to lock my fingers in. I'm going to push down with the heel of my hand and push back with my thumb. Again, the stock needs to be down and back because that's the direction of the torque when this blade engages with the stock. So once I squeeze the trigger, it's going to take a couple of seconds to get up to full speed. Once we are up to full speed, we're going to make our cut. We're going to hold the saw at the bottom until it comes to a complete stop. So here we go. Comfortable position. I can see the blade. So again, holding the saw at the full down position until it stops. Now, the logic behind full up and full down. Quite simple. If I were to pull the saw partly down and start it, the torque of that blade going from stationary to full speed causes that saw to jump upward, okay, on the start. So we always start in the full up position, so it has nowhere to jump. When we finish our cut, the inertia of the blade stopping will cause the saw to dive downward. So we always have the saw in the full down position when we stop. We let the blade come to a complete stop so that these smaller pieces don't become projectiles. Once everything's stopped, we can return our saw and then we can remove our stock.